All right, let's jump into this thing. So picture this. You're deep in the weeds of infrastructure as code, using Terraform to manage your cloud stuff right. Ever hit that point where you need to spin up a ton of virtual machines, each with its own little networking quirks? Ugh, talk about a copy-paste nightmare just waiting to happen.
Absolutely. Can
Oh,
you imagine trying to manually handle that many resources, the time it would take, the errors you'd run into?
yeah.
That's why Terraform has these things called for loops. They're like your secret weapon for automation, especially when you're dealing with data that's always changing. Like, think about configuration files in JSON.
Yeah, okay, that's what I'm talking about. The YouTube tutorial we're looking at today uses a real-world situation. They're building a whole Kubernetes cluster. That means masters, worker nodes, even a bastion host,
Mm.
and it's all defined in JSON.
Exactly. And that's where things get interesting. JSON's great for structured data, but getting Terraform to work with this nested structure directly, it's like trying to build, I don't know, like a house from this massive Lego set, just a jumbled mess. You got to organize it somehow.
Okay, so JSON is our mountain of Legos. How do for loops help us sort through this chaos and actually build something cool?
So imagine a for loop as like a set of instructions you apply to each item in a collection. It's like going through all those Legos and saying, okay, I only want the red ones right now. In Terraform, it'd be something like, for each item in this JSON data, do this specific thing.
So we're iterating, right? Going through the data and grabbing the specific pieces we need to use. Can you give me an example? How does this play out with the Kubernetes cluster?
Sure. Let's say your JSON data has definitions for all the different virtual machines in your cluster. A for loop can go through each definition one by one and use the info inside, like how much CPU, memory, disk space, to automatically configure each virtual machine.
Oh, I see. That's pretty slick. So no more manually copying and pasting those settings for every single machine. But what if things get even more complicated? What if we're talking about lists within lists, like different subnets for each virtual network in the Kubernetes cluster? How do we even...
That's where we bring in the big guns, nested loops. And this YouTube tutorial, it shows this perfectly. Imagine sorting those Legos again, but this time you're organizing by color first, then by size within each color. So you're applying that same for each logic, but on multiple levels.
Oh, okay. So you can get some seriously complex logic happening with this. In the Kubernetes example, we could be using nested loops to create a full list of subnets, right, for each and every virtual network. And it's all automated, all based on that initial JSON data. That's pretty powerful stuff.
It really is. And this tutorial, it does a fantastic job of explaining this complicated logic. It breaks it down step by step. But here's the thing. With nested loops, you can end up with really, really messy output. It's like, imagine all those sorted Lego piles. They're everywhere. But luckily, Terraform has this thing called the flatten function, and it basically swoops in to save the day.
To clean everything up, tell me more.
It's exactly that. Think of flatten as, when you stack all those neatly sorted Legos onto a single shelf, all ready to go. It takes the output of your nested loops, which might be all over the place, and simplifies it. It puts it into a format that other parts of your Terraform configuration can easily understand and use.
Okay, so flatten is like the final organizer. We've gone from this jumbled mess of data to a structured, organized set of instructions. And Terraform can actually use these to build our entire infrastructure.
Yeah, okay, I'm starting to see the appeal here.
Yeah, it's kind of like taking a messy workshop,
Yeah.
tools and parts everywhere, and turning it into this well-organized assembly line, everything in its place. But let's step back for a sec. Let's go from the how to the why. Why should anyone listening even care about this whole JSON and for loops thing? What's the big payoff here?
Right, we've gone through all the technical stuff, but it boils down to what this lets us actually do, right?
Yeah.
So what's the big aha moment? Just imagine for a second having to set up, let's say 100 virtual machines, all for this Kubernetes cluster. Each one needs its own CPU, memory, disk space, and all those network settings. Now, without using for loops, you're looking at doing all that manually, which honestly would be a pain, so error-prone, and it could take days to finish.
Yeah, I can definitely see how much time this would save, but it's got to be more than that, right? It can't just be about saving time.
You're absolutely right. For loops, they make your Terraform configurations, super adaptable. Let's say you need to add a whole new type of virtual machine to your cluster. Or maybe you got to change the networking for a bunch of them at once. Without for loops, you'd have to redo everything, manually update all that code. But with them, you can often just tweak the JSON data. And Terraform, it just takes care of the rest.
So it's kind of like having a self-updating blueprint for your whole infrastructure. You just change the inputs, the data, and the outputs. They just magically adjust.
Exactly. And this applies to way more than just virtual machines. Think about managing network settings, security groups, load balancers, you name it. Anything where you've got these repeating settings, but with slight variations. For Loops, they handle all those variations for you automatically, and they can handle huge amounts of data. It's pretty amazing.
Okay, yeah, that changes everything.
Yeah.
For anyone who's dealing with cloud infrastructure, especially on a larger scale, I mean, this YouTuber walks through a specific example, but it sounds like these for loops, they're useful in tons of situations.
Oh, for sure. Once you've got the basics down, you start seeing ways to use them everywhere,
Yeah.
to automate all sorts of tasks. And the cool thing about Terraform, it's got all these other functions and features you can use along with for loops. It lets you create some seriously sophisticated logic.
You're making me want to drop everything and go tinker with my own Terraform projects. But real quick, before we go totally off topic here, what are some of the common mistakes people make when they're just starting out with for loops? Anything we should watch out for?
That's a really good question. One mistake I see a lot is people forgetting to correctly use the iterator variable inside the loop. Remember, that variable, it's like a temporary placeholder for each item as we go through the data.
So if you mess that up, you're going to get some funky results.
Oh, yeah. It's like, think about following a recipe, but you accidentally put in the wrong ingredient at one step. Not going to turn out right. Another thing to watch out for is going overboard with nested loops. They're super powerful, but if you use too many, your code can become a nightmare to read and debug.
It's like they say, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Sometimes a simpler approach is better, even if it means writing a bit more code.
Absolutely. You always want to keep your code clean and easy to understand, especially as it gets more complex.
All right, so we've covered the basics, talked about the benefits, and even touched on some potential pitfalls. For anyone listening who's thinking about leveling up their for loop game, are there any other Terraform tools or techniques that work well with this whole concept?
One really powerful combination is to use for loops with Terraform modules. Modules, they let you package reusable pieces of your infrastructure code. When you combine them with for loops, you can create these super dynamic and customizable deployments. It's great.
So it's like you're building a library of building blocks, and then you use the for loops to assemble them in different ways.
Exactly. Picture this. You create a module that deploys a virtual machine with specific configurations, and then you use a for loop to deploy multiple instances of that module, each one slightly different based on your JSON data. Pretty cool, right?
That is some next level automation. We could probably do a whole deep dive on just modules and for loops. But before we totally lose track of time, you mentioned something earlier that caught my attention. Conditional logic inside of for loops. It sounds really powerful, but also kind of confusing. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's go back to that list of virtual machine definitions. Now, some of those VMs might need extra security rules, right? Depending on what they do in the Kubernetes cluster.
So not all the virtual machines are treated equal. Some need tougher security than others.
Precisely. So with conditional logic inside your for loop, you can check each VM as it goes through, figure out its role from the JSON data, and then apply the right security settings, all dynamically.
Wow, so it's not just blindly doing the same thing every time. It's like it's making decisions on the fly based on the information it has. That's awesome.
It is pretty cool, right? And that's where the real power of for loops comes in. It's not just about automating the boring stuff. It's about building smart infrastructure. Infrastructure that can actually adapt to changes.
We have been through a lot in this deep dive. We started with for loops and JSON, then went to nested loops, the whole flatten function, and now even a taste of conditional logic. It's been a wild ride. But I think the most important takeaway here is that feeling of empowerment. Knowing you have the tools to understand and control your infrastructure. It's like we started with this really complex Kubernetes cluster, all defined in JSON, which seemed like a lot. But now we can actually use that data to build something really cool. Like going from being totally intimidated by this giant Lego set to realizing, hey, I've actually got the instructions. I can build whatever I want with this.
Yeah, it's like instead of feeling overwhelmed, you feel like you have the power to automate and control all this stuff. And that's really what infrastructure as code with Terraform is all about,
And the thing is, we've only scratched the surface here. For loops, they're just one tool that Terraform has. And this YouTube tutorial, it's a great place to start, but there's so much more we can do. We can apply these ideas to so many different situations. It's not just about managing virtual machines and networks.
That's right. And it gets even more interesting when you realize that your data, it doesn't have to be stuck in a configuration file. Think about using Terraform with APIs, pulling in information in real time. You could dynamically provision and configure your cloud stuff.
Wow, okay, now we're talking about infrastructure that can actually react and adapt. The possibilities are kind of mind-blowing. But before we send our listeners off to create their own for-loop empires, let's leave them with something to think about. What do you say?
I always love a good thought-provoking question. So here's a challenge for everyone listening. Don't just think about the examples we've talked about. Think outside the box. What other creative ways could you use for loops in your Terraform projects? What about managing databases, user accounts? Could you even use them to deploy entire application stacks?
The sky's the limit, really. That's what makes working with infrastructure as code so exciting. There's always something new to learn, always something new to build. And hey, for loops, they're an incredibly versatile tool to have in your back pocket.
Absolutely.
So until next time, everyone, happy coding. And may your infrastructure be as elegant and efficient and as adaptable as a well-crafted for loop.